So I've covered spot and offtake prices. Market forecast is a very different exercise and something that I'm pretty excited about. Partly because it's new. We have just released it to select customers and over the past week, as opposed to the spot and offtake prices. We've been working on it over the last year, and many of our users have been interacting with it. The market forecast is new. We are refining it as we speak. And the thing about why it's exciting is because this has never been done before for carbon credit markets, full stop. And the reason here is there are substantial challenges in applying forecasting models for carbon credit markets, and I'll explain. Before joining Sylvera, I was actually an economist working across carbon markets, compliance, and voluntary markets. It's much easier to work on allowance markets, say the EU ETS, where every unit is fungible. An EUA is an EUA. And there is no sort of differentiation or quality differences between allowances within the EU ETS. And in compliance markets, there are actually well-tested approaches. And there's a vast body of research, solid research on how to model these markets. And the best practice is called agent-based modeling, which means you represent every single market participant or clusters of them as agents and think of them as price takers. Given the available information and prices, what will be this agent doing in any given year? So that's agent-based modeling. This has never been done in carbon credit markets because of some technical conceptual challenges. And as of this week, Sylvera, I think, has the only agent-based model for carbon credit markets. And I'll explain why this is kind of important in a moment. But just to identify a few challenges that conventional models struggle with. Carbon credit markets are interlinked, number one. And when I say that, I mean a single project could find buyers in different market segments. To be specific, let's take an example. A Cookstoves project in Uganda might be able to find buyers all over the world. It could find a voluntary buyer in the US, or if it obtains host country authorization for corresponding adjustments, it could supply it to a Japanese airline that's under CORSIA. So project developers often face these trade-offs, these decisions around, well, I want to find the highest price buyer, adjusted for, say, the cost of supplying to CORSIA, where there's insurance cost, there's corresponding adjustment fees, and so forth. So suppliers face these decisions across different markets. And similarly, buyers have decisions to make because they see each different project type and region as partially substitutable. A buyer who's considering buying direct air capture credits would be equally considering biochar credits or afforestation credits and so forth. So the interlinkages of markets make it difficult to model it. The second reason why conventional models struggle is that prices are differentiated, or I should say the carbon credits are differentiated. Every project has a different cost structure. Every project will be perceived differently, but between buyers. And this results in, naturally, a significant dispersion of prices across the voluntary carbon markets. And conventional models struggle at this because they typically think of a market as a single fungible good. And in fact, that is what a lot of people who enter this market as from a background from commodities or trading, they might have a model that is suitable for more standardized fungible goods. But in a market where there is significant deltas between projects in terms of the attributes, it's hard to apply those models. The third challenge is that the market is driven by complex policy drivers. We're talking about policy at the state level, at a national country level, or international level. And that could have significant impacts on markets across voluntary and compliance markets, of course. In voluntary markets, we also have to work with guidances or standards from, say, bodies like the SBTI or the ISO or VCMI. And these guidances shape demand as well. And of course, very few organizations have the capacity to track all of this information, looking at host countries across 30, 40 jurisdictions. But Sylvera, fortunately, we have the policy team to do this full time. And we are able to bring together that policy knowledge with a rich database of projects and prices to build a sophisticated model. So that is sort of an introduction of the challenges of conventional models. I'll talk you through next briefly how we approach an agent-based model. When I say an agent-based model, we're looking at individual supply sources and demand sources. On this illustrative table on the screen, you see each row being a project. So project 1, 2, 3, and so forth. As we said earlier, we have around 20,000 projects in the database. Then we look at the different individual demand sources. So we typically cannot simulate at a company level because you can never really pinpoint what a company would do in 5 years' time. But when you aggregate them together, you could say something more tractable and more reasonable about what this industry would do in 5 years' time. So we aggregate these demand sources, for example, energy and utilities, heavy industry for voluntary demand, and so forth. And for compliance demand, we look at individual compliance schemes, look at the policy parameters, the use of carbon credits in those schemes, and form a basis for the demand side. Now, with these individual supply and demand sources represented, we then have a giant matrix of supply and demand interacting with each other. And I should specify that some projects might be eligible to meet all kinds of demand. For example, project 4 on this matrix is green throughout, which means even CORSIA, Singapore, California buyers could consider project 4. But there will be projects where it is simply not eligible for any compliance scheme, say project 1. It's only eligible for voluntary demand. So we operate in this complex matrix of supply and demand interacting with each other. And you kind of need a fine-grained model to capture those linkages. And most models struggle with that. However, with an agent-based simulation, we could capture these differences and figure out, well, if the CORSIA market is served by project 4, but project 4 is also serving the voluntary market, that means a change in CORSIA would have an impact on the voluntary demand price. And that's sort of the test of a good model. It needs to explain how individual changes in individual market segments could affect the wider universe of carbon credits. So that's a quick tour of what it means to do an agent-based model. I then turn to sort of the model components of supply and demand, kind of giving you a flavor of what is assumed or what needs to be applied in the model. So on supply, we look at two sources of supply. Number one are what we call known projects. These are projects on registry. They're issuing all pre-issuance. Here we need to look at the delivery volume, the time lag, the cost structures of projects. Then the second component is future potential. So these are new investments in projects that are hypothetical. They're not yet on registry. So here, beyond the typical delivery rates and time lags, you also need to think about project setup time, the deployment constraints in various jurisdictions. On the demand side, we look at 4 types. We look at voluntary demand. So here we need to think about corporate emissions, how they approach carbon credits, the willingness to pay in the future. The second is CORSIA. Of course, these airlines are part of this compliance scheme. We could kind of calculate, given their emissions, the emissions trajectory, what that offsetting requirement would look like. And then overlay consideration of whether the regulators will enforce it. Number 3 on the demand side is domestic compliance. We look at schemes like California, like South Africa, like Singapore to figure out, well, given the demand for carbon credits, what does that mean for the supply and demand in the wider market? And number 4 is Article 6. For example, there are governments that will be purchasing carbon credits to meet the NDCs. So here we take a very detailed view at a country by country level, understanding what the likely emissions trajectory will be and their appetite for international credits. So that is sort of a quick tour of the supply demand components of the model. I'll now turn to a demo of it. But before I show that, I just want to emphasize that this demo is served to illustrate the capabilities of that tool. there are obvious components of it that I cannot unpack in this 1 hour call. For example, the exact scenario assumptions and why certain assumptions are made. But if you are interested in the fine-grained technical level details, please do reach out to us and I'll be happy to talk about it, because this is something that we are refining with a few select partners and would love more input. So with that, I'll just turn to the dashboard for market forecasts. So this is the dashboard for market forecasts. You can see it is structured under 3 tabs. So scenario overview, and a deep dive by project type, and finally a user guide, which is effectively a methodology note for people who want to understand all the assumptions, even download the assumptions for each demand and supply component. So I'll first talk through how these dashboards are structured, what sort of insights you gain from it, and through a few example use cases. So in this scenario overview tab, you can see up top just a chart of annual supply and demand. So on the left panel are credits issuances split by project type, and on the right will be credits retired or canceled split by different project types as well. And this is currently initialized on the low demand scenario. I would emphasize that we have 3 default scenarios at the moment. I won't go through all of them. And in fact, we will add quite a few more scenarios in the coming months. So the low demand scenario is a world where there's relatively conservative demand. There is limited appetite or limited growth in the appetite for carbon credits. And to understand why that happens, it requires a certain degree of judgment. And I should emphasize on the outset that none of these 3 individual scenarios represent, a best guess prediction. In fact, I think a nuanced interpretation will be to apply some sort of likelihood or probability on the 3 scenarios or more scenarios in the future, and understand that there's a possibility for these things to happen, and update your beliefs around the likelihood of these scenarios over time. Anyways, so this is the low demand scenario. You can see we have split the demand and supply by project type. In the same way, because every ton could be traced back to a particular country or region, we have the ability to plot these bar charts by the project region. So we have 6 regions in the model at the moment. We could definitely expand that going forward. We could also split that by demand source to understand the dynamics of the market. For example, now if I clicked at the demand source, you could see the supply grays out, of course, because you can't really say what issuance is traced to what's demand source. But on the right, on the annual demand picture, you can see 4 colors. So it relates back to the 4 demand components we have earlier. In sequence here is Article 6, CORSIA, domestic compliant, and voluntary. And because this is a low demand scenario, you can see that the green bit, the voluntary demand, grows very, very slightly over time. So now I'll move on to what's beneath that. We have a result summary that basically details all the additional outputs that we have. So you can see already this section is called prices on the voluntary carbon markets. You can see all the individual market segments we have in the model as of today. You can see that the CDR, durable CDR market segments are not split by region. However, we do split that by region for ARR, IFM, and RED projects. I should emphasize a distinguishing feature about our model is that it doesn't look at just, say, the median price. It captures the range of prices. If you double click on any row here, it shows you the median price, the upper range, and the lower range. And that, I should emphasize, reflects the variation, the natural variation between projects at any given point in time. And we should interpret these numbers by saying, this is the typical range of prices we expect in the spot market. And it is just a nature of the market where even within ARR, there's a very wide spread of prices. So that's prices on voluntary carbon markets. We will be looking at prices of compliance markets in the coming months. Then we have demand. As I said earlier, we split that into 4 components. Of course, in the very near term, the voluntary market is responsible for most of the annual retirements. We also have supply, which means issuances, so we could split them by project type or region. And finally, we have an estimate of the market value based on the typical market value, price times issuance quantity on the primary market. So this is a quick tour of the scenario overview tab. We would expect most people, if you're a project developer that's interested in a particular project type, to naturally go to the second tab, which is a deep dive by project type. To go into some more detail here, each view over here gives you multiple scenarios possible. So at the moment, I have set it to look at both the high and the low demand scenario, as you can see here. And for the project type, I have currently set to nature-based ARR projects. And as I indicated earlier, we could drill into any given region if that helps with narrowing down the analysis. But for now, let's take a look at this dashboard. We could quickly identify the range of spot prices on the voluntary market by the top left chart and across the scenarios. And you can see how demand has an effect on potential prices in this market segment. Then on the top right, we see a projection of demand. We could see that most of that is green, which means for AR projects, we envision most of the demand to come from voluntary buyers rather than compliance buyers in the next 10 years. On the left here, I'm scrolling to annual issuance split by project region. You can see historically it's mainly Latin America and Asia, and it could remain so. On the right is the credit inventory, which is analytically useful if you're interested in the tightness of the market. Typically, you think of market balances with retirements minus issuances or vice versa. This picture is effectively the cumulative stock of credits that are not yet retired or canceled. That's credit inventory. Then we also have users that told us, actually, I want to understand what's behind that issuance projection. Then we could look at this chart on the left. It splits the annual issuance into 3 chunks. One is issuing projects. Then we have the pre-issuance pipeline. Then we have the simulated projects. What it means is it tells you what is simulated at the agent-based model. The brown, but the issuing projects are effectively projects from registries which we have seen issues already. So actually, it's all this list on the bottom left here. They're issuing projects that contribute to the brown bits. Then the pre-issuance pipelines effectively are simulation, adjusted for, say, delivery rates and time lags, what the potential issues look like from pre-issuance projects, which are listed on the right-hand side over here in this table. So that gives you a very clear view of what we're assuming, what sort of projects are within scope or out of scope. I will also say we have a marginal cost curve on the right-hand side as well to give you a sense of the cost assumptions that have been applied to this market segment. So that is a quick tour of how you might use that deep dive into any particular project type. And as I said before, you could drill into any given region as well. And finally, we have the section on a user guide. It gives you a quick tour of the modeling approach, demand supply assumptions, and some frequently asked questions. Just to give you a sense of the level of detail that we have in this model, you could scroll to the section of voluntary demand and see exactly sort of the global emission scenarios that we look at, the implied voluntary demand across the buyer types. For domestic compliance, we broke it down to different individual schemes, as you see on the right. For CORSIA demand, we flagged this as something we're updating soon. But effectively, we have an airline by airline analysis, aggregate them up, and see what that means for offsetting requirements, the sectoral growth factor, and so forth. And finally, we have some assumptions about Article 6 demand from different host country, buyer countries, I should emphasize, that have indicated a willingness to use ITMOs.